Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Sam Adams. Yep, those anti-federalists did get it correct. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and we're just going to get jamming today. And it is, in so many ways, the best I can say is that this sermon by Ezra Stiles is something that every pastor in the United States, whether you're a leftist or even a really super reformed pastor that understands the whole contextual aspect of covenantal relationship and what it means in relation to we in America. This sermon by Ezra Stiles was in 1783. This is when the Articles of Confederation came into play, and it's titled "The United States Elevated to Glory and Honor." So what we're going to do here in this first segment is we're going to get a little background on Ezra Stiles, because when I really looked at who he is, and in the document, in the PDF that is there for you to download, or at least the link is there for you to download from the Belcher Society, this person, this amazing pastor, was by and far above and beyond, heads, shoulders, monumentally above and beyond 99% of the pastors in America today. And I'm going to explain to you why. And I'm talking about pastors that I know and have a lot of respect for. That's why I left it at 1%, maybe 2%, that have the same capacities as Ezra Stiles. Let me give you a little background. So Stiles, for context purposes, and I'm going to read from this document because it's critical for you to understand, and we need to be educated in men like him, because I'm going to take you through history and background that you've never learned in school before. So this is part 3 of the series that I have been talking about. And this is shocking history that I know, for the most part, you haven't learned before. And modern historians try to hide and destroy and minimize. I'm excited about this program if you haven't already figured it out. So what we have is Stiles. He was, in fact, a friend of Benjamin Franklin and the European community in itself. So it's real interesting in that relationship there. So Stiles' sermon was written in 1783, before the 1787 Constitution. Again, this is in context to what is going on in the various states writing their constitutions, as well as then the Articles of Confederation. So as he goes through and he's framing this during this period of time and taking and trying to get people to understand what is going on from that historical perspective, he comes up with several ideas that are about what a federal government was doing, what was current, in vogue, including one that Stiles mentions, that of rule by an elected democratical aristocracy. Interesting. But that was in vogue throughout Europe at the time, and to some extent was a point of interest within the continent even. So Stiles, he takes and he's influencing James Madison in constitutional ideas, and Madison had to be affected by this guy. And then you compare this following comment with the editor of Thornton's comment concerning Madison's ideas in relationship to Stiles. So Stiles writes, "The crown and glory of our Confederacy is the amphitonic council of the General Congress, standing on the annual election of the united respective states and revocable at pleasure. This lays the foundation of a permanent union in the American Republic, which may at length convince the world that all the policies to be found on earth, not excepting the very excellent ones of the Chinese Empire, the most perfect one has been invented and realized in America." So then Thornton, in what he did some editorial on in his book, he said, he quotes here, 5 years later in 1788, James Madison in the Federalist numbers 18 and 38 describe this celebrated institution as, quote, "It bore a very instructive analogy to the present confederation of the American Union," end quote. So, very interesting. So we go on and we look at Stiles mentioning here in this document the great Belisarius, 505 to 565 AD, general of Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine Roman Empire, who vanquished the Vandals. He talks about that. And it's been suggested that the ancestor of Belisar, also spelled Belsar, the ancestor of the Belcher family who came to England with William the Conqueror. And what they're looking at here is that relationship that Stiles also had to Belcher. So we look at a lot of other aspects in here on the history, the background, where Stiles looks at some of the writings in the 8 volumes of Mrs. McClure, whose histories of the England from the accession of James I to that of the Brunswick line, and going through that whole succession. And then the high Republican tone and noble zeal for liberty, which is in that work. So you sit here and say, okay, big deal. You know, you're talking so hot about Stiles. What is it that makes him so unique, if you will? So Stiles was always a champion of civil liberty and religious liberty. And he probably would not have agreed to taking Bible reading out of the public schools, taking religion out of the public square, or else he would not have made the following remark, and here it is as a quote: "The cultivation of literature will greatly promote the public welfare. In every community, while provision is made that all should be taught to read the Scriptures, all should be taught to read the Scriptures and the very useful parts of common education, a good portion should be carried through the higher branches of literature. Effectual measures should be taken for preserving and diffusing knowledge among the people." End quote. So we go on as that Stiles clearly indicated that he expected the Bible to be taught in schools. There's a lot more on that within the context of the Belcher Foundation. So let's get into Stiles' sermon in a little bit here. I'm still not done, because you need to understand how in this Stiles predicted what's going to happen, and I'm going to come back to it. We're just going to get cranked up. I'm sorry. This is going to take a lot. But let me first impress on you who Stiles is. He was one of the most learned and high-minded men of his time. He was familiar with the lore of Hebrew and Christian church. He understood it. He conversed and corresponded in Hebrew, Latin, and French with facility, and was learned in Oriental literature and antiquities connected with biblical history. He taught in astronomy, chemistry, and philosophy. He and his friend Dr. Franklin were among the earliest statisticians in America. And you're going to see in here, and when you really read this, he hits the numbers hard with data and proves the data. And his studies in this science exhibit the most comprehensive and enlightened views. That he was a thorough antiquary in manifest in history of the three tyrannicides, and that he was a true son of New England, appears in his saying that the day of the, quote, martyrdom of King Charles I ought to be celebrated as an anniversary thanksgiving that one nation on earth had so much fortitude and public justice as to make a royal tyrant bow to the sovereignty of the people. By extensive foreign correspondence, he kept up with the progress of knowledge and discovery to which he himself contributed. That he was a zealous and an understanding friend of civil and religious liberty, a man of practical knowledge and observation, a sagacious student of men and things, is apparent in his discourse on Christian union, which he wrote in 1760, as well as in this remarkable sermon in 1783 on the United States elevated to the glory and honor. The Chancellor Kent said at a commencement at Yale College in 1831, quote, President Stiles' zeal for civil and religious liberty was kindled at the altar of the English and New England Puritans, and it was animating and vivid. A more constant and devoted friend to the Revolution and independence of this country never existed. Take him for all in all. This extraordinary man was undoubtedly one of the purest and best gifted men of his age, though he was uncompromising in his belief and vindication of the Protestant faith. He was nevertheless of the most charitable and Catholic tolerant temper, resulting equally from the benevolence of his disposition and the spirit of the gospel. So, interesting man. He was born in 1727, graduated Yale in 1747, delivered a Latin oration in 1753 in memory of Dean Berkeley, and another at New Haven in February of 1755 in honor of Dr. Benjamin Franklin, with whom he had a lifelong friendship. He was a minister at Newport, Rhode Island from 1755 to the beginning of the war in 1777, became the pastor of North Church in Portsmouth, but was soon appointed president of Yale College, an office which he adorned, and died May 12, 1795. Just in this quick last minute, is that in this sermon, what he asserts is, number one, the United States of America was founded under God, that is, with the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty that makes the United States government a government of laws and not of men, for this discussion of the meaning of under God that's in the Pledge of Allegiance. And two, American laws were originally based on the Ten Commandments at the time the nation was founded. And then we go with another interesting quote as we finish this first segment out, is that whatever political mutations may arise in the United States, perhaps hereditary monarchy and a standing army will be the last. Interesting. Where are we today? We don't have a hereditary monarchy, but we'll talk about it some more when Sam Adams comes back and returns for the second segment. Welcome back to the second segment, and we're going to jump into what was going on in this sermon. Now, this sermon is over 50 pages long, and I'm going to take you through the first 19, and I'm going to do it in a way of just giving you some quick notes on what is going on in this sermon and what he's talking about from definitely historical perspectives. So what's interesting is that regarding Stiles' prediction of the United States, I'm going to open it with this. He opens by saying, in the writing, he says, the United States, degree of populations is such as to give us reason to expect that this will become a great people. It is probable that within a century from our independence, the sun will shine on 50 million of inhabitants in the United States. So the editor that was writing about him wrote in 1860 the following footnote. As deduced by method of finite differences from the census return in 1830, 40, and 50, the population of the United States will be, in 1883, 56,922,000 people. Thus, the official decennial enumeration more than justified the estimate made by Dr. Stiles from his comparatively crude data. Dr. Franklin made the same or similar calculation. Very interesting that we can see all of that and other predictions that happen here. But as we get into this sermon, and the sermon is the United States elevated to glory and honor. It's preached before His Excellency Jonathan Trumbull, Esquire, Governor and Commander-in-Chief, and the Honorable General Assembly of the State of Connecticut. And this was May 8th, 1783, as he was a president of Yale College. He opens with this passage, and to make thee high above all nations, which he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor, and that thou mayest be a holy people unto the Lord thy God, from Deuteronomy 26:19. It just becomes interesting from the very onset of this sermon that Dr. Stiles takes and he doubts whether political communities are rewarded and punished in the world only. Now, let me restate that. He doesn't doubt it. What he brings out is that there's a lot of people out there that doubt that. They doubt what may be going on based on the fact that they miss out on that omniscience, the deity, the Lord God, who he is, and his full sovereignty over everything. And he goes, there may be those that doubt that, but the fact of the matter is, and when you look at the Hebrew theocracy in particular, and you look at the Old Testament in general, is that nations, not just the Hebrew, the Israelites that were punished every time they were idolatrous or fell off from their association and their worship and their honoring and their allowing the living God to be their God and their king, they have judgment upon them. So too is true with other nations. Other nations rose and fell, and he goes through this very much in detail as he talks about how nations rise and fall according to God's purposes, and how long God can suffer that a nation will be evil until he finally sanctions them and he punishes them. So it's a matter of you're following what God is and under his sovereignty, Otherwise, you take and you get his retribution. This is true. America right now, these United States, are under God's judgment. And I know that there's a lot of Christians that don't want to hear that. And there's a lot of folks that just can't believe it because they don't believe that God is effective or affects anything in this world. But the fact of the matter is, as I was hearing a pastor out of Texas talking the other day in a very interesting podcast that he put up, you got to remember, folks, that Jesus Christ rose. He has a resurrected body. He ascended into heaven, and he is sitting on the throne. He's on the throne, and every nation will be below his footstool. And so he's got it right there. So when we start looking at everything just in these first couple of pages, page 6, history of the Hebrews, show that the secular welfare of God's ancient people depended upon their virtue, their religion, their observance of a holy covenant. That's where America started as well when we look at what we talked about in the first segment. A law dedicated with sovereign authority by the Most High to a people, to a world, a universe, becomes invincible force and obligation without any reference to consent of the governed. What happens is that if we don't understand these justices, then there is definitely all of that judgment that comes. God foresaw that, and in a rejection of God, predicted the judicial chastisement of apostasies. We just go on to page 7. And the two key points there are what reason we have to expect that by the blessings of God, the United States, these states can prosper and flourish into a great American republic. Secondly, is a key element of this whole sermon is that our system of dominion and civil polity would be imperfect without true religion. We see that in our present time. We're not seeing true biblical religion as we did. Instead, we're seeing all of the perversions of humanism to the extent that we don't have real virtue. We don't have true religion. And therefore, there's no good community. There's nothing there that lives up to the move towards holiness of God. And therefore, once again, civil government falls off and God terminates his relationship and allows us to fall into what Romans 1 tells us, turns us over to our sins. So when we look into how these branches come together and what these two areas are within this sermon, we consist of the true political welfare and prosperity and that civil administration necessary for the elevation and the advancement of a people in a secular glory. Then 2, the reason that we get into the rendering of the probable ideas of the United States that things are ordered in heaven and eventually work through the people. But he gets into it a lot more. And as we're running out of time, we're only on page 8. And what he does is he goes through the genealogy of Japheth. Now, if you don't know who Japheth is, and I may get hung up here, is that Japheth is one of the sons of Noah. And he takes you through that whole genealogy of it, and he describes the fulfillment of the prophecy regarding Japheth that expands and goes beyond the idea of Japheth living in the tents of Shem. And he takes you through that dispersion of the people where Japheth was dispersed through what became all of even the European continent, and then east all the way into what we know through India and China and so on. But what's really interesting to me as we move into a deeper portions of pages 9 through 12 of this sermon is that he considers the American Indians as Canaanites of the expulsion of Joshua, and this is proven through his historical research in Phoenician ships and along the Mediterranean coast that ended up coming to America. And there's inscriptions all along the routes of this being said. And this is one of the best histories, folks, that I have ever read of the people and tribes coming to the Americas. And that when you look at it, even from not just a genealogical study, but he looks at it from the fact that they have no facial hair. And who are these people that have no facial hairs? And he can go all the way back to the Canaanites that determines just through those observations of no facial hairs. And he takes that then through all of the various Indian tribes, both in South America, in Asia, as well as in North America, and how their routes, either across the Bering Sea from those that went into China and or those that were ousted by David, the Canaanites that were driven, by Joshua, not by David, but by Joshua, the expulsion that which went through Phoenician ships, traveled from North Africa, out the Straits of Gibraltar, and across to America, or to the continents of South America and the various islands along the way. Amazing detail. I don't have time to go through all of that with you. You need to read this. And that's on pages 9 through 12. You could actually start, if you want, which I suggest, on page 8 with the whole genealogy of Naphtha. It's amazing. Then on page 12, specific, he explains the illegal invasion that we are having right now of people types. It goes on to say, and this is a quote out of the sermon, "But after the spirit of conquest had changed the first governments, all the succeeding ones have, in general, proved one continued series of injustice, which has reigned in all countries for almost 4,000 years. These have so changed property, laws, rights, and liberties that it has become impossible for the most sagacious civilians to decide who is the best abstract political right in national controversies. Rather, we know that none of them have any right. All original right is confounded and lost. We can only say that there still remains in the body of the people at large, the body of mankind, of any and every generation, a power with which they are invested by the author of their being, to wrest, to take away government out of the hands of reigning tyrants and originate new policies adapted to the conservation of liberty and promoting the public welfare." We're going to get into this a little bit more in the last segment, but let me go with it, as I've said before in other programs, is that the people, except for the Chinese and jihadists that are coming to these United States to do us evil, who are there to come and destroy us, the rest of the people that are coming to America still have that tribal understanding of they are nothing. They have no idea of true property. They have no idea of true justice and law. They do not understand rights, and they have no concept of what true liberty is all about. Come on back. Welcome back to this third segment. Samuel Adams returns, and yes, more than those anti-federalists had it right. Dr. Stiles has written something here that is so deep in research, in statistics, in history, in what we now call sociology, in what we call any of the studies of ancient peoples and their histories. He nails it, and we're stupid of it and from it because of moderns. They only want you to know what they little find out, and then as a result, what we end up is with this goofy CRT and critical race theory and DEI and all of these other things, which are evils. Anyway, so let's move beyond what I was talking about. The invasion, in my perspective, comes from page 12, specifically as he talks about the people types and what was going on there. Let me zing and zero in more specifically into page 12, and let me see if I can pull out some extra nuggets for you. I mean, he goes on and he's talking about the invasion of the lawless Macedonian who effected the dissolution of the Medo-Persian Empire. Then you had the widespread Roman conquest, the inundation of the Goths and Vandals, and the descents of the Tartars on China, triumphance of a number of these other persons, and widespread dominions of the impostor of Mecca, and what happened there. And all this, now these caliphs started, and so on and so forth. Then with the new distribution of property, new erected policies, were all founded in unrighteousness and tyrannical usurpation. Now, this is interesting in what he's talking about there, because we're seeing within our own government right now unrighteousness and tyrannical usurpations of our property. Very clear. And they erected policies to do exactly that. So the real interest of mankind and the public good has been generally overlooked. And that's because we're not looking at it from that biblical perspective under the sovereignty and leadership of the Almighty God. So what we have is that the cause of right and liberty, which of the belligerent powers prevailed? So was it a Tangrolapix or a Mohammed, an Augustus or an Antony, a Specio or a Hannibal? Tyranny being the sure portion of the plebeians, be the victory as it should happen. So he talks about these things have led some very enlightened as well as serious minds to a fixed conclusion and judgment against the right and legality of all wars. So here he also starts to bring in a just war theory. And he talks about that, and we'll get into that just a little bit more later. But he said these things have led to some very enlightened and well serious minds to fix conclusions and judgment against the right and legality of all wars. In the simplicity of his judgment, and as what he's seen for years, been of this opinion, except as the offensive wars of Israel and the defensive war of America. War, in some instances, especially defensive, has been authorized by heaven. And he talks about where the blessing given to Melchizedek, by Melchizedek to Abraham upon his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, the king of the east, was justified, that holy patriarch. So then he talks about some other wars that are given and righteous by God. So just war. So I guess what we may even take the time to delve into right here, what is just war theory? We're taking and pouring billions of dollars into not just war, Ukraine, a number of the other wars that we have been a part of. They're not defensive. The war at the border would be justified biblically because that's defensive, preservation of our property and our rights. That's what just war is about. So when we look at this and we look at then what Joshua defeating and sending and beating and pushing the Canaanites out, that was God ordained. So when we start looking at the location of the respective territories to the First Nations, was so of God as to give them divine right defensively to resist the Nimrods, the Ninuses, the first invading tyrants of ancient ages. So he says here as well is that the originally free and glorious republics of Greece had a right from God to withstand the haughty claims of the Assyrian Empire, which they successfully resisted for ages till the Roman power arose behind them and at length prostrated their liberties, undergirded, laid them down, destroyed their liberties. So when we look at this, it is we have by God the right to maintain and keep our liberties, our national sovereignty. We have a right to do that. So then it goes into the quote that I already mentioned to you about what happens to those changes in property, law, rights, liberties. It becomes difficult for we as civilians when you have tyrants, as we do today, at all levels of government, from local all the way up to the national government. How do you maintain your liberties? How do you do that? So it goes on as he finishes that quote, is that to wrest government out of the hands of reigning tyrants and originate new policies adept to the conservation of liberty and promoting the public welfare. So true liberty is preserved in the Belgic and Helvetic republics. That was done there. He even goes through how it was done in the elective monarchy of Poland. And he talks about democratical polity for millions standing upon the broad basis of the people at large, amply charged with property, has not hitherto been exhibited except here in America. So when we look at this and what he goes through and continues through, and on page 13 in particular, is that true liberty is preserved in those manners that I mentioned. So the civil dominion, though often wisely administered, is so modeled as to be beyond the control of those whose end God instituted government for. But a democratical polity is all based on whether you have property. So he goes into this whole discussion on existing republics of time and through the history of it all. He says republics are democratical, aristocratical, or monarchical. Each of these forms admits of modification both as to heredation and power from absolute government and to perfect liberty. So in page 14, he moves into this whole discussion on hereditary superiority in monarchs or a council of state. Then describes how quickly a single ruler, a monarch, would become an absolute power monger. Then he finishes off, as I introduced you into the first segment, with a historical catch from this Mrs. Catherine Macaulay and what she was talking about in the ideas of a republic and how it's viewed, and looking at the supreme power in that relationship, and then what happens when you get into the factions of state governments. It just becomes encroaching in every other form of what does it mean to secure liberties. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know that I'm not going to be able to get all the way through, but we're going to jump into page 15 as we look into what was happening and continued to happen from a symbolic name given to priest in Pashur, who has the expressive faith that they announced by a prophet Jeremiah, that they had bad things that are going to come on to them when this person of Magor Mishabib was carried off into Babylon and died there. He had fear on every side of him, and that's where a number of leaders should be, is very afraid, because they're not allowing for that sovereignty of even the basics of a constitutional republic here in this nation. Stiles comments on, generally, what a well-administered government, and that these are things that are desired in politics. And then midway through that page, he lays out two options of governing for the colonies, now independent republics. They are states. And he qualifies the perfect government for the United States as this. And I mentioned it in the preface and opening in the first segment. And he quotes, and I quote him actually, "A well-ordered democratical aristocracy standing upon annual elections of the people and revocable at pleasure is the polity which combines the United States, and from the nature of man and the comparison of ages, I believe it will approve itself the most equitable, liberal, and perfect." Then he goes on this, finishing up page 15, lays out who has the power. Who has the power in a nation? Well, simply put, people with property. And then he sets the rationale for representative government. Let's finish off this last minute, though. At the beginning of this nation, and there's interesting folks out there that have that discussion, and this was an argument during the Constitutional Convention of 87, for the Constitution of 87, was that it was people of property that should vote. Because as we well see, people without property don't have an interest except self-interests. They want everything from everybody else. So that's been a problem in this nation when we transitioned and gave so many rights to vote and make decisions on issues, especially of taxation, that those issues impact everyone that is a property holder. And it's shown and proven to be extremely detrimental. And we see it all the time, especially with the Democrats. And that's why they want more illegals, because they don't have property. They just want to take it all from everybody else. And that is not a just society, not a just society at all. He has a lot more to say, and I wish I had more time, but I don't. The link is there at the website, over my shoulder, samueladamsreturns.net, and you can download this sermon for yourself. I highly recommend that you do and read it and understand Samuel Adams understood every point in this sermon. See you next week.